everyone. Thanks for joining. We are going to start now. Thanks, thanks for everyone who's joining. Give a few seconds for everyone to enter the room.
Hello?
Hi, Vanessa. How are you? We are giving a few seconds for all participants to join the room and in Zoom, and we'll start in brief. So thanks for joining. Thanks everyone in the audience. My name is Sebastian Rodriguez. I'm Special Projects Editor with Climate Home News. And we're halfway through COP28 now. And in a brief recap of what's happened here in Dubai, well, a lot is at stake for the second week, in which ministers will have to sort out a decade-defining text. And to start, maybe our our brief summary of what happened. We had an opening surprise on the first day, where countries agreed and reached a deal on loss and damage that would host a fund at the World Bank. Funding pledges then started to come and now amount to some $600 million, which may not be enough to fund the needs in developing countries, according to the World Bank CEO himself. Then world leaders came, among them Brazil's Lula, India's Narendra Modi, and France's Emmanuel Macron. Notably absent were the presidents of China and the US. Leaders at COP then signed to a bunch of declarations, among them on health, finance, and tripling renewables. Now, we have all of our eyes on fossil fuels, and in particular, the global stocktake text, which is the process of reviewing climate policies and steering them to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. In particular, all eyes are also on COP28 President Sultan Al Jaber, who is a CEO of a state oil company in the UAE himself. An article by The Guardian revealed Al Jaber made some inflammatory remarks questioning the science of a fossil fuel phase out in the past few months. And in a press conference yesterday, he pivoted back to his PR approved language, saying the statements were taken out of context and that science has guided his life. To analyze this and more of what's happened here in Dubai, we want to give a warm welcome to our panel of speakers: Vanessa Nakate, Ugandan climate activist and climate justice and UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador; Bernice Lee, who's research director at Chatham House with an expertise in trade and China; and Harjit Singh, who is head of global political strategy at Climate Action Network International, following adaptation, loss, and damage quite closely here at the negotiations. So maybe to start our conversation today, I want to turn to Bernice, and we want to ask you, after a week of announcements and speeches and perhaps surprisingly agreements, what has stood out to you from COP28 so far, and what are your overall impressions?
Thank you very much for letting me start very loftily, very high level. And the reason for that is because this is how I look at the COP. I look at it from a sort of helicopter view in many ways. And so if you start from a helicopter view, it started with a surprise before the COP, which is the US-China agreement, which actually set the stage for a baseline, I hoped, at the time, so that we can build on top of which. Now, we always knew that this COP was going to be about fossil fuels, because it was from the beginning, the writings had been on the wall. What we probably didn't expect was how many ways through which fossil fuel conversation came by at the moment. Now, of course, we are going back to some of the science question, even as you mentioned. And so far, in many respects, the presidency has been taking the heat almost for the fossil fuel sector, because a lot of the focus has been on he himself. But in fact, this is really the role of the sector that we really should be focusing on. And I think this is exactly where the language around where the text is going to get to is the point. I did a little test just now today in my, I'm sure we all are in a million WhatsApp groups. I asked everybody if you want to give me like 1 or 2 words to describe where you think we are right now. And the words that I got back ranged from fragile, impatient, optimistic even. And I thought that this is one of the is a cob of elephant, indeed. Depending on which part you touched and how close you are to where you think the heart of it is, then the more my conjecture at the moment is that the more likely you're going to feel that you are depressed, in fact, or disappointed. So in some sense, I think that that's sort of the starting point, which is where we are now getting into the meat of it. At midway point, it's easy to say, too hard to tell. In many respects, however, the writings are still on the wall that many countries are following what you expect their positions to be, in many respects. And I've no doubt that we'll hear more from both Hajin and Vanessa on some of these questions of the important ones that played out. So in terms of overall impression is that the focus on the presidency at the beginning meant that we haven't quite got down to what we need to get down to right now, which is what it really means in terms of how the world's relationship with fossil fuels will change and will evolve as a result of this particular call. Secondly, I think that the maverick pulling out of all these wonderful starting point, which means that in some sense, hopefully the COP presidency now feels that it's got a good basis from which, whether it's loss and damage, refinancing, financing, facilities, as well as obviously the question of tripling renewables, all are excellent starting point from which we can build really a proper locking in of more solid trajectory that we're talking about, because right now we're in danger of potentially locking in low ambition unless we are careful at this point. So I'm going to, with that, pass it back to you and the other panelists.
Vanessa, what are your impressions so far? Are you feeling as Bernice said, impatient, optimistic, disappointed?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm disappointed because some of the things that are kind of happening were expected. And I realized that, the co-president is saying a lot of different things at the same time. And there's really a question of trust and where exactly he stands. Because one moment he will say that, the North Star, the North Star that he's working on is to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And then the next thing you'll hear is that he has said there's no science behind, the need for a phase out of fossil fuels. And I think in a way it can also be worrying, especially for activists, I believe, and civil society, because the climate crisis is affecting so many people right now, and there is a need to to phase out fossil fuels right now, especially with what the science says. The latest IPCC reports showed us that we need to have emissions by 2030 in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So how are we able to do that if we don't address fossil fuels that account for 75% of the global greenhouse gas emissions? So for me, I think I'm in a place of not being able to trust, what is happening in this space, because the co-president himself is saying, contradicting things when it comes to fossil fuels. However, we as activists, civil society, we're doing everything we can to raise awareness about the impact of the climate crisis, but also the need for a fossil fuel phase out. I think today also I read an article that is revealing that in this place there are, about 2,456 fossil fuel lobbyists who have access to the COP. Again, even that is why I think that the fossil fuel industry has for a while had a lot of power over the COP process. And when you look at how the years have gone, I mean, from when I started attending the COPs, you realize that the number keeps increasing with every COP. So it's kind of hard for to think that the representation of the fossil fuel industry in this place is actually addressing the climate crisis. Otherwise, they would have already addressed it in the previous COPs. And I think this year the number is extremely high. It's extremely worrying that instead of addressing the climate crisis, there could be a number of new deals that are being discussed that may not favor the well-being of the people and also the planet.
And before turning to Harjeet, I just want to remind our audience that our questions are open in the comments. So if you have a question for any of our panelists, we'd be happy to take them. Harjeet, I want to get your overall impression so far, and particularly with that surprise in the first day with the loss and damage fund.
Sure, Sebastian. Let me build on what Bernice and Vanessa said. And I don't think I can define my emotions in one word, but let me try two. One, I'm anxious. As Vanessa said, when you get mixed signals, when you're not getting the right picture of where we are heading. At the same time, we are determined as civil society. As Vanessa said, we are trying everything possible. And the success that we got at COP, the very first day of COP28, is an example of what civil society and activists can do. Everybody knows that it was driven by us, and governments did not have ambition to really get the loss and damage fund. And of course, we then worked together and we finally got it. So civil society and climate justice activists have played a very important role. And we are now putting the same emphasis on fossil fuel phase out. We are very clear that more fossil fuels equals more loss and damage. So we are not here just to get a loss and damage fund, and even that is not sufficient. The kind of pledges that are coming, they are welcome, no doubt. We needed that. We needed that 20 years ago, and now we also need to talk about the scale. So there are gaps in terms of what we have got. We need to talk about capitalization. That is really missing from the conversation, and that's also connected to what we can get in the global stock take. So yeah, a good start. And in a way, it is precedented because it never happened that at the first day of COP you get such a decision. And another good thing is now we can put all our attention, or most of it, on the issue of fossil fuels. We have to make sure that we get the decision on fossil fuel phase out. And that is so critical. But at the same time, and also building on what Bernice said, I would look at beyond what is being negotiated. So if you look at the global stock take text that came out this morning, it's extreme positions, no language on fossil fuels to phase out an orderly and just phase out of fossil fuels. Of course, we would also like to add the word equitable, because just doesn't really cover that part. Now, the challenge is that on one hand, we are talking about these options, but in the real world, countries are continuing to expand fossil fuels, even the ones who are trying to become champions. I'm sure you must have seen the report coming out from Kick Polluters Out campaign telling us how many lobbyists, again, Vanessa referred to that. France brought representatives from Total Energies and EDF as part of its delegation. You can see Italy even having a representatives of ENI in its own team. EU brought employees of BP, ENI, and ExxonMobil. That's what research has found. So the hypocrisy has to be called out. And some of these are the ones you hear, we are all for fossil fuel phase out. But in the real world, if you're doing it this way, and we know that after Russian invasion in Ukraine, the same countries who were claiming to be climate leaders went to Africa and started drilling and rigging, right? That's not acceptable. So we, on one hand, definitely we want to see a strong commitment on equitable phase out of fossil fuels. At the same time, we want to see it in reality, because when we say loss and damage, when we say impacts increasing, that's the reality we are facing. Every fraction of warming matters, and we cannot, add fuel to the fire. As simple as that. And another thing that we have seen here is those flurry of announcements that happened during the World Leaders Summit and on the sidelines. They don't add up. And for that, you don't have to come to UNFCCC. If they do not have any legal stand, and you can't hold them to account, then for us, it's a distraction. For us as civil society, I have seen even for negotiators, they are being pulled into it. Even media is getting distracted. They are saying there's so many announcements. We want to focus on negotiation. So I think the whole format of where we just go for this flurry of announcement is not helpful. We are here for a very serious business. We want to produce a legal text so that we see actions coming from governments in terms of change in policies and practices. Let me stop there. We can't hear you. At least I can't hear you.
Sorry,
Yeah.
building on that point, Bernice, I want to return to you. What has been your impression of the COP presidency up until now, and especially speaking about fossil fuel production, right? Because the UAE is one of the countries planning to increase uh, production of fossil fuels while discussing a phase out. So, what would be your impressions of the work done so?
Well, look, I appreciate there's a question of hypocrisy always, but that's obviously a question of how do we manage conflict of interest. I mean, there are always conflict of interest in many ways. It's a question of how we manage them. And at the same time, it's a question of expectations as well, whether or not we should be expecting a chairman of an oil company to be leading the charge for decarbonization. Now, my answer to the question is, well, show me I'm wrong. If indeed you want to demonstrate you could do it, then I feel that we have to see a lot more from this leadership that could really lead the charge for all sorts of changes that EDNOC and others have suggested that they have been leaders around, whether it's about, for example, gas flaring, etc. So I think that the starting point is that it obviously is not helpful and it's distracting to have, and by the way, it's more than distracting. It's probably extremely unhelpful that all these things came out about the presidency. But at the same time, we are only halfway through. And therefore, the fact that they did deliver or they did shouldering, pushing through, first of all, the voluntary pledges, as well as the loss and damage, obviously, up front is obviously a sign of the kind of shock and awe leadership that they like to play. So, I mean, obviously, my personal view is that I would like to see more of that if possible. And obviously, the proof ultimately, this is a hard thing to say, is going to be in the pudding, whether or not they really can, in fact, shepherd the text all the way to the end through including fossil fuel phase out in the text itself. And so in some ways, I think that the unfortunate thing is that even though it has a lot of deliveries, at the moment we are focusing on the questions about the presidency in a way that perhaps doesn't get us to focus enough now on whether or not, first of all, fossil fuel sectors, and by that I mean companies as well as countries, what they're doing. And obviously there's a oil and gas decarbonization initiative. I can't remember the name, forgive me. I have a really heavy cold right now. And by the way, if I run into any of you in Dubai, please give me any cold medicine that you have in your hand. I think that we should focus on the contribution in terms of decarbonization, whether or not they really are doing it, and not just in terms of CCS, that we now looked at the numbers that we're talking about, trillions of dollars that we need adding to it, instead of wind and solar that we're talking about. The numbers, I think 500 billion a year. I'm looking at all the numbers just now that I'm sure is easy for everyone to Google in terms of the additional cost involved, which I can also come back with as well. Secondly, is this money that they are going to make, how are they going to contribute to things that we know we need? And not just things that we had traditionally talked about. So I think there's a whole question about how we're going to spend the money for them if they're going to make the money from us, and with them, so that we can all sort of move forward together, and whether or not they really can contribute. So I think this is a long way of saying that if the presidency can help shepherd the text as well as the transformation of the oil and gas sector, both in terms of how it deals with emissions, but also how it uses its money onto things that is helpful for climate mitigation, climate resilience, all sorts of climate adaptation related stuff. I think that will be a new debate that we look forward to getting into. Thanks.
Thank you. Vanessa, I want to redirect a similar question to you and get your impressions on the participation of Sultan Al Jaber as COP president, but also, as you mentioned, the participation of fossil fuel lobbyists and yes, the presence of the fossil fuel industry in these talks. How do you feel about that process? And even with an ambitious outcome in the final text, do you feel confidence in a leader's ability to deliver on those outcomes?
Well, I mean, in addition to what has been said, there have been a lot of announcements, and there's a worry that leaders are adding new fancy promises on old broken promises. So I believe that's where the issue of accountability comes in, to ensure that what the leaders actually promise to do, they fulfill. And we've always seen a challenge with that, where it's not just the finance, but also when it comes to other climate targets. We've seen countries like the UK go back on its climate targets. We know that five wealthy countries are responsible for 51% of the planned oil and gas developments through 2050. And many cases, these are the countries that call themselves climate leaders. These are the countries that are making, these announcements of finance. And in a way, it kind of makes it look like all these announcements are being a distraction for the true agenda of the COP, which is worrying, because there are lots of millions of dollars that are being announced, but then there is a worry about the root cause of the climate crisis being discussed. There are a lot of announcements about addressing the symptoms of the crisis, but then when it comes to phasing out what is causing the crisis, I think that is where the challenge comes from. So from the side of finance and the side of fossil fuels, whatever comes out on the text, there's a need to push for accountability, because again, we've seen pledges being made, promises being made, and we've seen them constantly being broken as well.
Thank you. Harjeet, we're actually getting questions from the audience at the moment, and many of them are referring to the new loss and damage fund, which we also have questions about, because it seems the discussion about loss and damage kind of disappeared into the fringes for a bit, with all attention going to fossil fuels. But what are the next steps for the loss and damage fund, and what are the key challenges that are coming ahead?
Sure. So as I said, it was a historic decision, unprecedented, happening on the very first day, but doesn't go really far enough. And I've engaged with the process for a long time, and also attended all these 5 transitional committee meetings where the decision was finally taken in Abu Dhabi. And we know that it really did not have all the elements, especially when it comes to scale. Currently, there is no mention of scale in the document, when we know that the loss and damages are already reaching the point of about $290 to $580 billion. That's the range studies. These are old studies. By 2030 annually in developing countries alone. So we need to talk about hundreds of billions, whereas there is no figure mentioned. In fact, developing countries did put forth a proposal to mobilize $100 billion initially by 2030. If that doesn't happen, and if we create a fund which only has a couple of millions of dollars, it's not going to help, because needs are much, much greater. That's one. Second, capitalization. Of course, we have got these pledges. Number is now touching 700 million, according to our estimates. But again, it's nowhere near the need. And what about the process of capitalization? You can't just depend on these pledges, and you need to create a system of capitalization. And then at the same time, we also need to relook at the decision that we got on the replenishment cycle, which is every 4 years. I think 4 years is a very long period when disaster impacts are increasing every year. You need to find a way, and of course, even you can't just depend on annual cycles. That's also very challenging. Then you are like hand to mouth all the time and you are raising money. So we need to find a way of making sure that much more money is mobilized. So now what next? Because we still wanted that decision to be adopted. Global stock take. It has some elements. It doesn't talk about scale in terms of numbers, but it does talk about the gap that exists. Another language that we are pushing for, and we can now see it in the text, which is connection between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. This is extremely important, and let me highlight why. When we talk about mitigation, where also numbers are changing based on very many market related determinants, but loss and damage completely depends on the rise in temperatures or the control that we are going to be putting in, and adaptation capacity, the resources that you are going to provide. If we continue to see temperatures rising and if you are not supporting countries to adapt, loss and damage bill is going to grow exponentially. So, and the mistake that we made of committing to $100 billion, look at it, wasn't enough. It was not based on any analysis. That's why we always say we need needs-based finance. And the need will depend on the ambition that we get both on mitigation and adaptation. So GST, that's why, is a very important process, because that covers the whole spectrum. We need to plug that in. And some language is there, but we need to strengthen that. At the same time, NCQG, new collective quantified goal. That's where some of these missing elements can be added. And of course, GST becoming the cover text, which also means that you send a political message that those weaknesses are there. And next year, of course, then we'll be working on with the board on resource allocation framework and some other aspects. So we know that what we got is not good enough. With the World Bank, we actually took a bitter pill, knowing the challenges with the World Bank. But with those conditions that have been put forth now, if World Bank fulfills that condition, we'll see how it goes. So that's where we are with the loss and damage fund.
Bernice, we also have a question on the political.
You're not audible again.
Sorry, Bernice, I wanted to turn to you because we had a question about the political signals, and in particular, the more silent ones in the case of China. One member of the audience asks, how significant is it that she did not come for the high-level segment, and how do you see China's role in influencing the discussions on fossil fuel phase-out?
Thank you for that. I think that, I don't know why he didn't come. I don't know why the president, how they decide which one to come in. We know that he generally likes to go to your General Assembly to make big announcements. So I can only kind of assume that he didn't come because either he felt that, in fact, I'm suspecting that he felt that, in fact, I have no idea, as you know, that, in fact, what they announced before COP, the Sunderland Agreement, was already quite significant. And I think that in some ways, while it isn't the US-China agreement, it wasn't the be-all and end-all, it certainly set the stage that superpowers could put aside their differences and start talking to each other about climate change, and even agree on areas where we kind of knew that they wanted to but hadn't agreed on for a while, such as, for example, plan around methane and stuff. So I think that I'm suspecting that that's one of the reasons why that decision was made, and I don't really know how the machinations work. How significant, however, it is. Now, the question then is whether or not we will be taken by surprise, that despite the fact that he didn't come, there is still a rabbit somewhere that could come out at some point from China on these questions. Now, from what I have been listening the last couple of days from, for example, people, the Chinese, those stakeholders associated with China, let's just say, the sort of general language atmospheric is very much a focus on implementation and delivery. It focused a lot on the renewables that is already in the pipeline, has already been delivered in China, the electric vehicles, and you all of you would have heard speeches from China-related stakeholders on these questions. Now, we could say it's politics, and it is probably partly politics, and it is important politics, but at the same time, it is also an important reminder that, in many respects, that more ambition has to be built on delivery in some ways, but at the same time, that empty pledges have to be, or pledges in general should be backed by more delivery, whether you are China or any other countries in the world. So I think that to me is the important part of the conversation that China currently seems to be trying to shape, which is around the importance of delivery and implementation. And on that part, nobody can necessarily disagree. Now, the question then becomes whether or not, that being the case, what next in terms of the fossil language. I mean, look. I mean, again, I would like to be surprised. I have no idea what is in the bag that is already being discussed between US and China. We all speculated whether there was a formal language that was there, and may or may not come forward. And of course, my suspicion is that if indeed that was the case, then perhaps that would indeed be some that would affect whether or not China will feel comfortable or not at this point in signing up to the language that, as we know, it has traditionally challenged. If you stick to the different types of discussions that you've heard China and Chinese stakeholders engaged in, they are still on the sort of connection between obviously mitigation, adaptation, and finance. And in some sense, I'm not hearing a lot of direct comment on those issues, other than those that suggested that it is about differentiated treatment, is about different capacity, and etc. And so, in some sense, I think that a lot of it, my view is that a lot of it would depend on the extent to which it has already been discussed as part of the superpower compact.
Vanessa, I want to redirect the next one to you because we also received questions from our readers before the event, and human rights came up quite often, and I want to ask you about about how does that relate to the issues being discussed, particularly in loss and damage, for example, and what would you see as a successful outcome for the global south uh, regarding human rights, and in particular, how would you see the loss and damage fund operating in a way that it would address climate emergencies with human rights at its core?
Well, thank you so much. I'd like to start by sharing a story that was shared by someone else to us. And this person was telling one of the women who is helping out at the conference and working at the conference. She's a woman from Bangladesh. So the person was, telling her about the loss and damage fund and how it was operationalized. And then she asked the person if the people in her community will ever be able to access the money, for example, that is being pledged. And I think for me, what will really be a success when it comes to loss and damage and vulnerable communities, I think it will be that the money reaches the communities that really need them. Because I think for her question was, this money is being raised, but will it reach, for example, my family if they experience a disaster? Will it reach my community? So there is a need for the finance to be able to reach the communities that really need it, the communities that are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And on the bit of human rights, I believe the fight for climate action hasn't just been a fight for a switch to renewables. It has also been about the people, because climate change it's more than statistics, it's more than data points. It's really about the people. With every statistic that is given of thousands of people dying, or millions of people being displaced as a result of a climate disaster, it goes beyond the numbers. It goes to your understanding that these are people, these are individuals, this is someone's parent or someone's child who has probably lost their life. And what I've seen with the movement has been that we are not just calling for a switch to renewables. We are calling for the well-being of the people on the planet as well. Because I've heard from fellow activists, for example, from the DRC, who have talked about how thousands of children are working in mines in order to provide the minerals that are needed for electric vehicles. So someone may say that electric vehicles are one of the things that are needed for a sustainable future. But then if you don't look at the, the human rights violations within the supply chain, then you may end up, promoting a product that is in the process harming other communities, harming children, and, leading to forced labor or instability in certain communities. And that is why it's really important that, climate action doesn't leave anyone behind. For some people that, they've seen things about carbon markets, for example, being a good thing, but for some communities, they've seen it as something that has led to their land being taken away and, them being displaced because, a certain piece of land where they were staying is now, it no longer belongs to them. Someone is using it in order to address a climate solution in their own understanding. So, and I think that is where also the aspect of a just transition, a just and equitable transition really, really comes in. Because even as we call for a phase out of fossil fuels, we are aware that, there are people that are employed in the fossil fuel industry, millions of people who could, lose their jobs. And that is not what we want in the movement. We want a transition that allows people to be, to receive their capacity building, to be able to be trained, to be able to have that smooth transition into a more sustainable world. We don't want to leave people jobless. We don't want to leave people, in extreme poverty. And I think that is what a just and equitable transition really looks like. And that really carries the issue of human rights at hand. Or otherwise, we would just say, we need to shut down all fossil fuel investments right now. But then if we do that, we know it could shut down the economy, it could affect families, individuals. And that is why, we're not just calling for a transition, but we're calling for one that is just, we're calling for one that is equitable, for one that is fair, for one that doesn't leave anyone behind. And that includes the people living in frontline communities, but also people who are working within the fossil fuel industry. We always talk about how, investing in new fossil fuels right now would, lead to stranded assets and also increase debt for global South countries. But many times we don't talk about how, a transition could also lead to stranded people who don't have jobs, people who don't know, what next to do if, the fossil fuel industry is shut down at once. So I think that is where the aspect of a just, a fair, and equitable, a fast transition really comes in, that no one is left behind, including those that are currently being employed by the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you, Harjit. I also want to get your thoughts on the role of human rights in the fund, but also in the ecosystem of the fossil fuel phase out and the discussions around that, because it is mentioned in one of the options of the text we have as a base for the discussion. So the other options are no text, right? So I want to pass the word to you.
So Vanessa has covered it very well. Let me add from GST perspective and even from loss and damage perspective, where it's there in the preambular text. Again, we need to recognize that we are not here to just pay lip service to the issue of human rights. It's extremely important to have it in the preambular section, in the operative section. And in fact, on loss and damage, we demanded that. And now when we develop the allocation framework, we are going to push for that once again. Now in GST, again, as Vanessa said, from people's perspective, it's about whether they are getting the required support to make that transition. That is human rights. At the same time, we also look at the way fossil fuels are extracted, how it causes displacement, how it causes the ecosystem destruction, and environmental degradation, and people are losing their traditional and lands. So it that's also human rights violation. Or when you burn it, I come from Delhi, which is the most polluted city in the world, and when I breathe that air, when I'm paying taxes, it's violation of my human rights. Right? Government is supposed to provide me clean air. So I think we need to look at the whole issue of human rights from a very wider perspective. But at the same time, I would also like to connect it with finance, which is not done. Rich countries may sound very much in support of human rights. My question to them is, if you don't provide climate finance, and if developing countries are not able to make that transition, or not able to adapt, or not able to recover from disaster, is that not violation of human rights? That's the fundamental question. We should also connect human rights with climate or lack of climate finance. That's violation. Who caused the problem in the first place, and who is not supporting developing countries and vulnerable communities to now deal with the challenges? So I think we need to, again, I'll bring the word hypocrisy here. We know the US will always talk about, I believe in human rights. And beyond climate, also look at what the US is doing around the world. That is also a violation of human rights. So it's not just those words. We need to make sure that we, use human rights also in letter as well as spirit.
Bernice, I want to ask you about also your impression. Bernice, I want to ask you about your impressions on the stocktake text, and precisely on the several, say, the drastic the drastic options that Harjeet was also mentioning before. You either have a very ambitious option, or an option for no text, that's in the phase out language, but also in the renewables. What are your or how should we interpret that as the negotiation process from the first week?
So thank you for that question. I think it's look, anyone who look at it very carefully, and I'm not sure that I'm one of them, will suggest that it is a text at the moment with lots and lots of things. And I think someone described it to me earlier as a sort of pick and mix option at the moment. So it's hard to discern from where we are right now to see where we may be distilled on the other side. We know how important the global stocktake is to the Paris Agreement. We know how important it is that we set goalposts as well. Obviously, it's not just an assessment, but also set goalposts for the future, which is why it is important that in some ways we don't want to lock in things that locked in low ambition, but at the same time, we also don't want to start from scratch at the same time. So it is obviously a balancing act that needs to happen. We know that there are more than half the countries want a fossil fuel phase out in the text. Another similar number, I think 120 or something, back to sort of tripling renewable energy, etc. But of course, all of this has to happen as Harjeet and also as I mentioned, with balancing other considerations such as finance at the same time. So this is why these are all kind of the basis of the binding deal that we need for getting to the other side, feeling that we actually spent the time well in the last couple of weeks, if not months and years. And therefore, I think that right now what is clear is that we are looking forward to some kind of showdown in some ways around these questions, because at the moment, especially right now, as Harry mentioned, that we are talking about, or people are talking about, relatively extreme options. And I think that while it is easy to moan about whether or not COPs are effective, is it really effective to have all the government in the same room, etc., etc., it's easy, and lots of people who moan about it would use this as a way to try and reform everything at the same time, like we could do that tomorrow. These, as I said before, like these smarty pants think that you can do everything tomorrow if we reform it. So in some sense, not striking the balance and not getting the text right when it comes to the future direction would be actually the act of giving up the lifeboat, the only one that we have. So I think the danger, I think for me, is for the voices that want to use this as a way to basically drop it, reform it, the COP, so that we don't have these governmental processes. So I kind of feel that it's just important that we defend the integrity of the process by making sure that the governments come together around a strong text that really signal the direction of travel that many, many countries, as well as science that we have understood. And I don't want to get into the conversation about the sciencey bit, in terms of the presidency, because I think that it's not entirely clear that that's a helpful piece of distraction right now. But at the same time, the lifeboat is about finding that right balance and making sure that that language does not lock in low ambition. Because remember, anything we lock in here could be referred to again and again later on. So therefore, finding that balance is extremely important. And I hope very much that much smarter people than I am, that are the negotiators, will find a way to find that important balance, to signal the direction for the future in such a way that also makes sure that we're not locking ourselves into the different roads of no return that we've heard about. Thank you.
Thanks. And Vanessa, I also want to get your expectations for the upcoming weekend, and particularly around the language on fossil fuels, and kind of what would be the consequences of that not making it into the final text, particularly for youth and communities of the world.
Well, I think that when it comes to language, I think it's very important that the text avoids languages like unabated fossil fuels, because this would create room for many of the technologies that are being pushed by the fossil fuel industry, technologies like carbon storage and capture, which have not reached the commercial scale to address the climate crisis, which do not address the air pollution that kills more than 5 million people annually, and which the IEA says it is risky and it is expensive as well. So I think that it's important that the language includes all fossil fuels, because unabated would mean that not all fossil fuels will be included, and technologies like carbon storage and capture will be really amplified within the fossil fuel industry and also within the government, and this will allow for business to continue as usual. What I sense from everything in this place is that the fossil fuel industry is trying to do everything they can to save the industry. They're doing everything they can to to get the very last drop of oil or coal or gas. And I guess that is why there are a lot of fossil fuel lobbyists in this place. There is something that someone said, I don't remember who, but someone said that if you are going to have a discussion on malaria, then you shouldn't discuss the mosquitoes, because they would not really address the treating of malaria or the prevention of malaria, as they only continue to spread it. And I see it in a way that with the fossil fuel industry being in this place and having so much control, I believe that the only acceptable role that the fossil fuel industry has is to phase out all fossil fuels, without excuses, without exceptions, without distractions. And we are not yet seeing that. And again, that is why the presence of activists and civil society is really, really needed in this space, to be able to to call out the sabotage of the fossil fuel industry, and to call out the confusions that are coming from the presidency itself, because again, it's like we are in that place whereby at any moment the co-presidency will say they believe in the science, and there's a need to reach 1.5 to phase out fossil fuel, and then in another scenario the same presidency would say that they don't believe in the science. So I think there's a lot of work that we really need to do to raise awareness on what is happening and also push for just and equitable transition.
Ajit, on your expectations for the second week, there is a lots of decisions to be taken by ministers who are arriving next week, and is there a risk to the credibility of the process, being this a decade-defining text, being this one of the last moments to keep 1.5 on track, which is absolutely vital for small countries, these developed countries, and small islands. So, is there a risk to the credibility of the process if we don't get a good outcome?
Well, I would say now going forward, there's going to be a lot of focus on the global stock take, because that's what now encompasses all the key elements. And it is going to be a determining moment for us, because we are, as the name says, we are taking stock of where we are and then a forward-looking decision on what needs to happen. So it's absolutely critical. And we got the text this morning, which was accepted by parties, which became the basis. And now more submissions are happening. And then tomorrow morning, we are expecting another text. So I can also see a question in the chat on what's going to happen next week. So this is where the negotiations are still going to continue at the technical level. I'm expecting early next week, and then it's going to go to ministers. And I'm feeling positive, at least on the decision. Now, how strong that decision is and whether it meets all our requirements, particularly on the fossil fuel language, that question remains. But we are going to be putting a lot of pressure on all parties. And while Vanessa touched upon carbon capture and storage, I would also like to mention that we don't want to see the world unabated. And different kinds of arguments keep coming in. We don't want this unabated language to help the fossil fuel industry prolong the use of coal, oil, and gas. And that's exactly their strategy. And you can see in the text, appearing as options to talk about removal technologies, low emission hydrogen production. It is very concerning, because this is their way of making sure that they remain in business. Uh, and I must say that, yes, we are talking about equitable and just phase out in developing countries, but fossil fuel industry, has to understand that it is beginning of the end of their era, and they must recognize that. Even the renewable energy language that is there, the ambition is not enough. It's not going to replace fossil fuels. So I think we have certain elements in the text, but we need to now make sure next week keep the good ones and throw the bad ones out, so that eventually what we have is a robust decision. We are discussing global stock take, which is a 5-year cycle process. And now, we are already at a point where we're living through climate emergency. We just cannot afford to conclude this process, which is not giving the right direction and setting a right path for us to phase out fossil fuels. And I must also mention something extraordinary that happened at this COP, which is not part of this process, but which also points towards the gap in this process, which is where Colombia calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And I think it's important to understand the context. Some of these details that we are discussing now, after 30 years, should have been discussed 3 decades ago. And we never, and what Vanessa was talking about, if you ask countries like Nigeria and Azerbaijan and Angola and Timor-Leste and Colombia to stop right now, what are we referring to? We are saying basically you just won't have any money to feed your people or build infrastructure. So this is exactly the reason we need a plan. We don't need these fragmented elements coming, which doesn't really provide a full picture. And that's why Colombia, a country, a president that actually won elections based on that commitment that we are going to phase out fossil fuels, is struggling because there is no international support going to a country like Colombia or Timor-Leste. So the fact remains that this process is not providing a comprehensive support to countries who are even willing to phase out fossil fuels. I think we need to take it very seriously that Timor-Leste and Colombia are calling for a process, a new global treaty, so that they can be helped. They are willing. And in this process, we have only seen finger pointing and blame game. Now imagine if you have such countries, fossil fuel producer countries who are on board and they don't get support. This is laughable, and this is injustice. So I think we need to really understand how and what we can get in this process. Obviously, we want GST to have a strong language. At the same time, we should start exploring other options to make sure that we complete that picture, because those terms, coal, oil, and gas, were avoided in the Paris Agreement and in the convention, and we cannot just afford to do that anymore.
Thank you. We have some questions also from the audience. I'll post the last one to you, Harjeet and Vanessa. One audience member asks if do you have an impression that civil society is constrained due to COP28 taking place in the UAE compared to previous venues, say Egypt or the UK? And if so, what are the implications of for the outcomes of the negotiations?
Vanessa, do you want to go or do you want me to start?
Can you please rephrase the question? I didn't hear you very well.
They're asking if you feel the civil society has been constrained in any way due to the COP taking place in the UAE, and if so, does that affect in any way pressure into the negotiations?
Well, I know that I know that there have been actions organized, but I also know that civil society would most likely express themselves in much bigger actions or much bigger protests than what we are seeing at the COP. I think the last time we've really seen like big actions from civil society, I believe it was COP26. So yes, as much as there is space for actions, I think it's still very limited, and there is so much that we would love to to do when it comes to raising awareness through actions and protests, but the space is limited and the timing as well is very limited.
I can quickly add, so protests are legally banned in UAE. However, we are able to do protests exactly the way we have been doing in the blue zone. And blue zone is a UN area. And so our rights are protected. And we have been doing a lot of actions calling out rich countries who have not delivered or talking about finance. So I think all those things we have been doing. In fact, space-wise, if I speak, there's a lot more space than what we got in Egypt. And this time we've also seen that there's Faith Pavilion, and there are many more such. CSO Hub has been provided, which is letting civil society also engage, in their own groupings. I think the most important aspect now that the World Leaders Summit is over, is how much access we will continue to get in the negotiation space. We are not here to talk to ourselves. We are here to influence the negotiations. And that should not be curtailed. As negotiations advance and get more tense, we don't want us to be locked out of the room. We want us to be inside, watching and also influencing. That's why we are here, right? And now going forward, as we talk more about the real stuff, our being in the room and influencing is extremely important.
Thank you so much to all the panelists, and thank you so much to all the panelists and to everyone who joined the event. We have to close now because we're out of time, but we could certainly talk for hours. Thanks, and be sure to subscribe to Climate Home's daily newsletter here from Dubai, and we'll be back next week with a closing webinar discussing the outcomes that we get from next week's final decisions. So thanks a lot, and thank you.
Thank you very much.